The United States owes roughly $38 trillion. That's 38 followed by 12 zeros. But here's the question most people never stop to ask. Who does America actually owe all that money to? China? Japan? Wall Street? The Federal Reserve? You've probably heard that China owns a massive portion of America's debt, but that's one of the biggest misconceptions about the U.S. economy. China owns only a fraction. In reality, much of America's debt is held much closer to home. American pension funds, banks, investment funds, insurance companies, individual investors, the Federal Reserve. And here's where it gets strange. Some of the debt is even held by accounts within the U.S. government itself. So America's $38 trillion debt isn't one gigantic loan from another country. It's an enormous web of IOUs spread across America and the global financial system. But how did that web become worth tens of trillions of dollars? To understand that, we need to follow the money. So where does all this debt actually come from? It starts with a simple problem. Every year, the U.S. government collects trillions of dollars through taxes and other revenue. But it also spends trillions on Social Security, Medicare, defense, infrastructure, federal agencies, and hundreds of other programs. And when Washington spends more than it collects, it creates a budget deficit. Imagine the government collects $5 trillion, but spends $7 trillion. That leaves a $2 trillion gap. So the U.S. Treasury borrows the difference. It does this by selling Treasury bills, notes, and bonds. Investors hand the government money today, and in return, the government promises to pay them back later with interest. Now repeat that process, year after year, decade after decade. Those annual deficits begin stacking on top of each other, and that's how you get the national debt. The deficit is what the government is short in a single year. The national debt is the accumulation of all that borrowing over time. But that brings us to the much bigger question. Who keeps buying all these American IOUs? So who keeps buying all these American IOUs? This is where one of the biggest myths about the national debt falls apart. You've probably heard that China owns America's debt. China does own hundreds of billions of dollars in U.S. Treasury securities. But that's only a fraction of the total. Japan is also one of the largest foreign holders, and investors and governments around the world own U.S. Treasuries. But foreign countries are only part of the story. A huge amount of Treasury debt is held inside the United States. Mutual funds hold it. Pension and retirement funds hold it. Banks, insurance companies, businesses, state and local governments, and individual investors can all own Treasury securities. The Federal Reserve also holds a large portfolio of treasuries as part of its monetary policy operations. And then there's an even stranger category. Some federal debt is held by accounts within the federal government itself. Certain government trust funds invest in special treasury securities. In simple terms, one part of the government has a financial claim on another part. So don't imagine America's national debt as one gigantic $38 trillion bill sitting on China's desk. It's better to imagine an enormous network of IOUs connecting Washington with investors, institutions, and governments around the world. And that raises another question. Why are so many people willing to lend America money? Why does the world keep lending to America? The answer starts with trust. U.S. Treasury securities sit at the center of the global financial system. For generations, investors have treated treasuries as among the world's most important low credit risk financial assets. The United States has a massive economy. It has deep and liquid financial markets, and the U.S. dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency. That matters enormously. Central banks around the world hold dollars as part of their reserves. Global trade and finance frequently use dollars, and institutions need places to store enormous amounts of money. Treasury securities help fill that role. Imagine you're managing billions of dollars for a pension fund. You can't simply put that money into a checking account. You need assets that can be bought and sold in enormous quantities. Treasuries provide one of the deepest markets on Earth. And during periods of financial panic, investors have often rushed toward U.S. government securities rather than away from them. That creates an extraordinary advantage for Washington. The United States can borrow enormous amounts of money in its own currency, but that doesn't mean it can borrow forever without consequences. How did the debt get so big? America didn't accumulate tens of trillions of dollars of debt from one president, one war, or one recession. It happened over decades. Federal spending repeatedly exceeded federal revenue. Wars increased borrowing. Recessions reduced tax collections while increasing some government spending. Tax cuts affected revenue. Major federal programs expanded, and America's aging population increased pressure on programs such as Social Security and Medicare. Then came major emergencies. After the 2008 financial crisis, federal deficits increased sharply. And in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic created an extraordinary economic shock. Congress authorized trillions of dollars in relief and emergency measures. At the same time, government revenue was affected by the economic disruption. Federal borrowing surged. Then another problem became more important: interest. When interest rates were extremely low, financing a huge debt was less expensive than it would be at higher rates. But when rates rise, newly issued and refinanced government debt can carry higher interest costs. And with a debt measured in tens of trillions of dollars, even changes in average borrowing costs matter enormously. Eventually, America can find itself borrowing partly to cover the cost of servicing debt created by previous borrowing. That's when the size of the debt begins affecting the budget in ways ordinary Americans can actually feel. Can America just print the money? At this point, you might be thinking, if the United States controls the dollar, why doesn't it simply create enough money to eliminate the debt? Because creating dollars doesn't create real wealth. Imagine the government suddenly created trillions of new dollars. America wouldn't instantly have more houses, more oil, more doctors, more factories, more food, or more workers. There would simply be more money competing for the economy's available goods and services. If money and spending expand far beyond the economy's capacity to produce, inflation can become a serious problem. So America's ability to issue debt in its own currency is extremely powerful, but it isn't unlimited magic. There's another complication: the debt ceiling. Unlike most countries, the United States has a statutory limit on the amount of federal debt that can be outstanding under the limit. Congress periodically has to raise or suspend that ceiling as necessary to allow Treasury to finance obligations already created by federal law. If political conflict prevented Treasury from meeting its obligations, the consequences could be severe. Treasury securities are deeply embedded throughout global finance. A genuine U.S. default could damage confidence, disrupt markets, and potentially increase America's future borrowing costs. So America's greatest financial asset may not actually be the dollar itself. It may be trust. What happens if the debt keeps growing? Does this mean America is about to collapse because the debt is around $38 trillion? No. The raw number alone doesn't tell us that. Economists also compare government debt with the size of the economy and examine the government's ability to service it. A large and growing economy can support more debt than a small, stagnant one. But debt cannot be treated as meaningless either. As interest costs grow, they consume a larger share of federal resources. Money spent servicing debt can't simultaneously fund another program unless the government raises additional revenue or borrows even more. Persistent large deficits can also reduce the government's room to respond to future wars, recessions, or emergencies. And over the long run, Washington faces difficult choices: spend less, collect more revenue, reform major programs, grow the economy faster, continue borrowing, or most realistically, use some combination of these. There is no painless button that makes tens of trillions of dollars disappear. The real $38 trillion story. So, who owns America's roughly $38 trillion of debt? Not China, not Japan, not Wall Street, not the Federal Reserve. At least not any one of them alone. America's debt is distributed across an enormous financial network. American investors, pension and investment funds, banks and insurance companies, the Federal Reserve, government accounts, foreign investors, and foreign governments. The national debt is therefore more than a giant government credit card bill. Treasury securities are also fundamental assets inside the global financial system. And that is why the most important number isn't necessarily 38 trillion. It's confidence. Confidence that the United States will continue paying its obligations. Confidence in the dollar. Confidence in America's economy. And confidence that Treasury securities will remain dependable financial assets. For generations, much of the world has been willing to lend the United States extraordinary amounts of money. As long as that confidence survives, America retains an enormous financial advantage. But if that confidence were ever seriously damaged, the number on the national debt clock might become the least important part of the story.